is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, good evening and welcome to Cross Question, LBC's weekly political panel debate show. We'll be here in LBC's Westminster studio each Wednesday at 8 p.m. to answer questions from you, LBC listeners. Now, as well as listening to us on the radio, you can watch us on Global Player and on LBC's YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds. If you'd like to take part in the show and ask our panel a question, all you have to do is pick up the phone and dial 0345 6060 973. The lines are open now. All previous episodes of the programme are on the Cross Question podcast, and this show will appear there before midnight tonight. Well, it's time to introduce you to our panel. I'm joined in the studio by the chairman of the Conservative COVID Recovery Group, former Chief Whip Mark Harper, Spiked Online columnist Inaya Folarin Iman, and joining us from Scotland is former Scottish Labour leader and now director of the John Smith Centre Institute, I do apologise, Kezia Dugdale, and also with us is the trade unionist and author of the recently published book Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. Paul Embery is here. Welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's from Erin in Scarborough. Erin, hi, what would you like to ask?
Oh, hi. I'm just a little bit concerned about the vaccine, and should the panel think that this vaccine should be mandatory, or should we have the freedom to make the choice whether we take that vaccine or not?
Well, as chairman of the COVID Recovery Group, Mark Harper, I'll come to you first.
Well, a great question from Erin, and it's really good news, obviously, that we've got the first vaccine approved by our independent regulator for use. I'm very clear, and in fact, I think the Prime Minister was asked this question earlier. I think it shouldn't be mandatory. I think it should be up to individuals' choice, but particularly at the moment, because we don't actually know whether the vaccine stops people being infectious or not. We know it stops them getting symptoms of the disease. But I think in this country, vaccines have always been for people to choose whether they have them or not. And I think that's the right way to run it. And I think also
they only work if most people do choose to take them. And there was a YouGov poll out today that showed that 1 in 5 people might not take them. That's quite a large number.
It is, but you also have to ask yourself the question, if you were to make it mandatory, what effect would that have on people's views? And a lot of people who are perfectly happy to take one if it's voluntary, I think would recoil against the state forcing them to. So my own view is the way to deal with this is to focus on what we know, which is we've got an independent regulator. Our regulator is actually envied around the world. It's got a very, very good reputation. The head of it this morning did a fantastic press conference, very clear, very robust, I thought very factual, supported by some other scientists. Jonathan Van Tam, whose little video he made this morning, explained how we've gone through this process and how we've done it safely but quickly. And I think that's the sort of information you need to give to the public. And I think if you do that, particularly when people look at the huge consequences of COVID, I think most people will take it and we'll be able to, once we've dealt with all of the people who are most at risk, then we'll be able to get back something like normal.
Kezia Dugdale, I think I was right first time, wasn't I? It was John Smith Centre, not Institute, so apologies for my apology. What's your view on this?
I find myself agreeing almost entirely, if not completely, with Mark. When I listen to Erin state that she has concerns about taking the vaccine, I want to understand what those concerns are and be sure that my government and all the health professionals and scientists and researchers in the country are committed to try to alleviate the concerns that she's got, because Mark's right. The more people that take this vaccine, the better the health of the country, the economy and everyone within it. But he's right, it shouldn't be forced upon people. That's not the way that this will work. It'll be much better if we walk together as sort of one people towards a kind of new normal, whatever that might be in the mid to late 2021.
Well, let's go back to Erin. Erin, what are the concerns that you have?
The concerns I have is perhaps that there's been some kind of disclaimer or get-out clause, and that this particular vaccine wouldn't be on the vaccine injury compensation programme. And, that would be a huge concern for me. It's not that I'm a strong anti-vaxxer. I'm a genetic engineer originally, a research scientist. I've been involved in clinical trials. I want to look at this as if it would be treated like any other vaccine, that we would have recourse to compensation if things went wrong, because we don't know yet.
Paul Embery, that's an important point, isn't it? Because certainly the Irish government have given dispensation to various drug companies. I'm not sure if our government has too. Is that a concern that you have?
Well, obviously, it's good news, and well done to the scientists for developing it. I agree with what people have said. It should absolutely not be mandatory. I don't particularly want to live in a country where the state can say to you, we're going to stick a needle and inject something into you, and you have no say in it. But I have to say, Ian, I think this seems to me to kind of disguise the broader point, which is that I think we have become so desperate for a vaccine because we've lost all sense of proportion throughout the wider debate. We do have to remind ourselves that, yes, COVID-19 is real. Yes, it's unpleasant in some cases. Yes, it's dangerous in a small number of cases. But we shouldn't forget it does not present a serious threat to the overwhelming majority of people. It's not the Black Death. And I was researching some figures today from NHS England, and I checked them just before I came on the programme. The number of deaths in England of people under 60 and with no pre-existing conditions since the beginning of the pandemic is 349. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that means we should abandon the vulnerable. On the contrary, I think we should have done a much better job, frankly, of protecting the vulnerable, especially in care homes. But I do think, as some scientists have argued, there should have been a more targeted approach from the beginning, because I think we are only scratching the surface, really, in terms of what the blanket lockdowns have done in terms of the impacts on the economy and people's health. The reduction in cancer screenings, what will almost certainly be higher rates of death from cardiovascular disease. So yes, the vaccine is good news. No, it shouldn't be mandatory, but let's not lose sight of what's going to happen in terms of the economy of this country and the well-being of this country when we come out of this thing.
Well, that's three of the panel saying no to a mandatory vaccine. Are you going to make it four, Inaya?
No, I would also say no, but I think one of the worries as well is that, it can be kind of functionally compulsory in the sense that so many institutions or kind of shops or even flying might say that you can't do this unless you actually take it. And so I think that definitely needs to be mitigated against, because if it ends up being kind of compulsory by the back door, it doesn't matter what the kind of politicians say as a kind of
You're effectively talking about the vaccine passport here.
Exactly. And so I think that is genuinely a concern. I agree with Erin. I think that one of the problems has been in the debate is that when people express concerns, they're often kind of dismissed as anti-vaxxers and things like that. I think that's incredibly unhelpful, and I think that transparency and making sure that it's clear that it's not going to be compulsory, but this is the information out there to actually ensure that there's trust and encourage more people to do it. And I think that that's the way forward, instead of kind of dismissing people's concerns.
But why shouldn't an airline, for example, insist on you showing evidence that you've had a vaccine before you get on their aeroplane?
Well, I think that there are legitimate concerns that people have about it, and I think that if you are saying that you shouldn't be allowed to have those concerns, it's compulsory for you to be able to kind of essentially live a functional life, a proper life, without having taken the vaccine. I think that that's very concerning, and I think a lot of people are actually healthy. And so if you're saying that you are healthy and you can prove that, for example, you've tested negative for COVID-19, but you haven't taken a vaccine, and because of that you still can't live a full life, then I think that you're essentially creating a two-tiered system where you've got people effectively being treated like second-class citizens if they are healthy but don't want to take the vaccine. I don't think that's a good way to go forward.
What about this, Mark Harper? Because the Welsh Government are, I think, going to give people a sort of credit card which they can show as proof that they've had it. Now, I don't think that'll be mandatory, but you can imagine lots of companies, organisations might want to demand proof.
Well, I think, first of all, there would actually be no scientific rationale for doing that, because at the moment we don't know whether having the vaccine stops you being infectious. And the only possible legitimate reason for doing that is if it stops you transmitting it to somebody else. If you choose not to have a vaccine and you get ill, that's up to you. But also, I still think effectively making it mandatory by allowing companies to do that, I don't think would be very sensible. I prefer the solution that was just set out, which is to look at testing. So you might say to someone, you've got to demonstrate you're not infectious, but it seems to me you can just as well demonstrate that by having a test to show that you're not infectious, now that we've got those fast tests that can see whether or not someone has COVID or not. That's not unreasonable, but I just don't think I just don't want to live in a society, as Paul set out, where effectively the state forces you to have a vaccination. And I think we talked about...
force you to live under the restrictions of Tier 3, for example. I mean, we might come on to that a little bit later.
I think it's about the effects you think it's going to have. And my own view is, I think one of the reasons why I said what I said at the beginning about the MHRA being independent and so forth was because there are people out there who we might call anti-vaxxers, who I think are irrational and so misinformation. But we don't want to give them weapons to do that more. But also there are people with perfectly legitimate questions. And what we want to do is answer the legitimate questions and not create circumstances where anti-vaxxers can get more people to believe the misinformation and the lies that they spread. And so we have to be very, very careful.
Kezia, how important is it for there to be a one United Kingdom approach to the vaccine? Or do you think that there are going to be big arguments between the different governments about how it's rolled out, the logistical difficulties that there are inevitably going to be, etc., etc.?
Surely not, Ian. I mean, not a day goes by without everything being seen through a constitutional prism when it comes to these issues. The reality is that we have devolved governments across the United Kingdom. We have mayoralities who've come to the fore throughout this crisis. You can have a sort of one UK-wide approach, which is to celebrate the fact we have a vaccine and we want to distribute it across the country, and also recognise that there will be differences. Different priorities will be set in different parts of the country based on their own local circumstances. I know Nicola Sturgeon will be very clear in setting out what she wants to do in Scotland when she's got her 10% share of the vaccine allowance, and that's perfectly legitimate for her to do that. She has the powers to do that. The people elected her to do that. I think we can be very at ease with having devolved administrations and delegating power and letting people get on with the one shared priority, which is to get the country moving again. Really struck actually by something that Mark said earlier. Isn't it interesting how we've become so binary in everything? So if you're not prepared to line up tomorrow instantly for a jab, you're suddenly an anti-vaxxer. I know that's not the point Mark was making, but he's right. People should be sceptical. They should ask questions. Those questions should be tolerated and answered. That's a healthy kind of democratic process and event. We need more of that in the country. For far too long, we've convinced ourselves that we have to be in one of two tribes, and once you're in that tribe, the other tribe is an enemy rather than an opponent, or even just somebody that you disagree with. So there's an opportunity here is to collectively work to improve the kind of state of public discourse throughout all this as well.
Erin, thank you very much indeed for your call. It's not often we get a genetic engineer calling into the programme. In fact, let's quickly go back to you, Erin. What did you make of the answers that you've heard?
I think the point about the Black Death was very interesting, and I also think about the lack of division. We do not want to cause division, and we're being placed in camps. You're an anti-vaxxer, you're a vaxxer. And it has to come down to just freedom of choice once you're given enough information.
Thank you very much.
Solid information, you can make an appropriate choice that suits you and your health and your family and so on.
Thank you very much indeed. Great question to start the show with. Interesting question coming up in just a few minutes' time on Scottish Independence.
Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 18 minutes past 8. If you've only just joined us, we are joined by Mark Harper in the studio, MP for the Forest of Dean and Chairman of the Conservative Recovery Group. Inaya Folarin Iman is Spiked Online columnist. Kezia Dugdale is Director of the John Smith Institute. You may remember she was also lead of the Scottish Labour Party. And Paul Embery is a trade unionist and author of a new book. I'm going to be interviewing him for my LBC Book Club podcast in a week or two. It's called Despised, Why the Modern Left Hate the Working Class. You might want to ask him a question on that later in the show. 0345 6060 973. Well, our next caller is ready. It's Anthony in Staines. Fire away, Anthony.
Yes, hi everyone. If If Boris Johnson was to call an early Scottish independence referendum in, say, 2021-22, what would be the outcome?
It's an unlikely probability, I would have thought. But Kezia Dugdale, let's come to you first.
Well, there was a poll released at lunchtime today, actually, which showed that support for independence was at 56%. And I think it's maybe the 18th consecutive poll which has shown yes ahead of no. So if that were to happen, I think the evidence is quite compelling that it would be a yes vote next time around. I don't see that with any real relish. I think, as Iain describes, it's unlikely that Boris Johnson would do that. But bear in mind, it was David Cameron who granted the last Section 30 order to allow the Scottish Parliament to have an independence referendum. And we have had a constitutional debate defining every issue from wheelie bins to fishing policy since. It's the only thing we talk about in Scotland. So I don't anticipate another one with any great relish, but it is coming.
If we were having this conversation, say, in 2012, I think the opinion polls would have shown support for independence at around 29-30%. The fact that it's now nearly doubled, what does that say about the performance of unionist politicians since the 2014 referendum?
I mean, I could talk to you about this for hours, Iain. We could devote a whole programme to it.
One day you may.
Yeah, there's an awful lot going on here, but I think the one thing that I kind of highlight more than others is just how important the issue of Europe has been to voters in Scotland. So if you look at who has moved from no to yes in recent times, it is unquestionably people under the age of 45 who are educated, who live in urban centres, whether that's Edinburgh or Glasgow, and would consider themselves to be centre-left, centre-ground or slightly left-wing in their outlook on life, but care about their economic security. These people tend to be passionate Europeans. They certainly believed in the European Union, certainly voted to remain, and are very angry that they're leaving. So when Nicola Sturgeon says to them they're being dragged out of the EU against their will, that resonates, and that's moved them from no to yes. So that's definitely been a significant factor. The demise of the Labour Party since the 2014 referendum is another cause and effect, because a smaller, less powerful Labour Party in Scotland means that the only people advocating for the union are Conservatives. So you only really hear a centre-right case for the union. You've not heard a centre-left or a left-wing argument for pooling and sharing resources for a long time now. And when you do hear it, it comes from a lot of the bases of the past, dare I say it. So you hear it from people like Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown, who are big political beasts with a lot of very profound and important things to say, but they're not current representatives in parliaments. They're not on the TVs every day. They don't necessarily kind of represent the lives of the people who are thinking long and hard about how they'll vote next time around.
Inaya, what do you think the result of a Scottish referendum would be if it were held in the next 18 months or so?
I mean, I genuinely don't know, but I think that, at the moment, kind of Scotland's almost like a one-party state. The SNP, dominate the airways and shape the narrative, but I think that if there was a kind of constitutional question brought to the fore, then we'll genuinely have to have a kind of public debate about it, and therefore there'll be an opportunity to kind of question many of the narratives that the SNP have put forward, and have an opportunity to really open up the conversation. But I think that there's been a kind of failure to kind of make the case from the union, not just on the part of the kind of Scottish MSPs, but also I think in Britain there's been a significant reluctance to kind of be patriotic and kind of defend the United Kingdom and be proud of British history and kind of what we've done together. So I think that actually all of the politicians need to be much more forthright in making the case for a kind of civic nationalism, a kind of British patriotism that I think across the union we could all benefit from.
As Mark Harper, in 2014, that was the initial Project Fear, wasn't it? That was the argument that it wasn't Leave and Remain. What was it in Scotland in 2014?
It was yes and no.
Yes and no. Yeah. Well, the people who were David Cameron and the Unionists were promoting a Project Fear campaign in 2014. Now it kind of worked then, but in the long term, it's proved disastrous, hasn't it? Nobody has been able to articulate the case for the United Kingdom properly.
Well, look, I think answering Anthony's question directly, which is if Boris Johnson called an early referendum, I don't agree, as you didn't when you introduced it. I don't agree with the premise of his question because I remember back to... Well, let me just deal with why I don't agree with the premise and then I'll give him my answer. So I think the reason why I say that is because when we had the referendum, which was 6 years ago, the nationalist politicians agreed that was a once-in-a-generation decision, and that's not... I mean, you can have an argument about what's a generation, but it's not 6 years. And I don't think it's healthy, as Kezia says, that Scotland spends all of its time debating constitutional matters and doesn't debate, the SNP's performance on running education and health and all the things it's responsible for, where I would argue it's not actually doing a very good job, which is why it keeps wanting to change the subject. So I think the Prime Minister would be perfectly within his rights to say, you said this was a once-in-a-generation decision, and you're not having another one for some considerable time.
But if they won a majority at next year's Scottish Parliament elections, and it's in their manifesto that we want a second referendum, they've got the majority of seats, they may get the majority of votes, who knows? Surely that mandate overturns that commitment in 2014.
Well, you do then have an argument, I think, for those of us who are unionists, about whether in those circumstances, although I think you could perfectly well justify not having one, you then get into a position where if there's a clear view amongst a majority of Scots that they want one, if you just keep saying no, the question you have to ask yourself is, does that then make it more likely you harden those people into being against unions? So that's a question. Look, we'll have to confront that. That's an after next year's elections. But I do agree with you. I think we need to have if you like, a multifaceted argument. One is absolutely about the economy, because I think, we've had this with Brexit. The rest of the UK is Scotland's biggest market by far, but it's all the other ties. It's the family ties, all of the people, the history that we've got, as Inaya said, about a shared history where I think we are genuinely stronger together. And better together, which was the campaign last time. And I don't think we articulate that enough. And that's not just a job for Scottish politicians, that's a job for all politicians. And I'd echo what Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross said, which is that London politicians need to be much better at articulating that than just Scottish ones. Before
I come to you, Paul Embery, I'm going to bring in a related question to this, because I think this will be right up your street, so you can combine the two answers. Andre is in Southport. Oh, no, actually, it's not a question, it's a text. I do apologise. Second apology of the evening, in fact, the third. Is Keir Starmer capable of winning back Scotland for Labour, or the Red Wall, for that matter? So it's completely allied to the question, Paul. Answer both of those together, if you would.
I think he's got a mountain to climb as far as both are concerned, to be honest. I mean, certainly there is no route back to power for Labour that does not pass through those old Red Wall seats and seeks to win the hearts and minds back of the voters who voted Tory in such large numbers for the first time in December. And it could be argued, actually, that there's no real route back to power for Labour that doesn't win back Scotland as well. My view, as I set out very clearly in the book, is that the Labour Party itself needs to undergo radical change before it can even think about winning power, because it is so far removed from its traditional base and actually has largely become a party of students and the managerial and professional classes and social activists and middle-class liberals living in our fashionable cities, and has been hollowed out, really, of working-class influence. It used to be a happy coalition of Hampstead and Hartlepool, and that's when it was most successful. Now it's almost all Hampstead and not enough Hartlepool, and the Labour Party has paid a huge price for that. In terms of Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP and independents, I think it's one of the wonders of politics that they are not called out for the inconsistency of their position on this and exposed for it more than they are. The fact that they are so desperate to get out of one union because they want to regain their sovereignty and make their own decisions, and immediately upon doing that, hop into bed if they could possibly get away with it with another union, the European Union, and immediately trade their sovereignty and their ability to be able to run themselves. I tend to think that, I don't know what the answer would be in terms of predicting whether they would vote yes or no. I think in the end it's probably a bit like a footballer who's on your books but doesn't want to play for you anymore. At some point you've got to realise that he may well just have to go for the benefit of the club and himself.
That's enough about
we may
Dimitri
be in that position.
The front cover of The Spectator this week, I've just seen, is headlined "The Sturgeon Paradox. The worse she does, the more popular she becomes. Why?" asks Alex Massey. Kezia Dugdale, answer the question.
Because she's an excellent communicator. It is probably the most direct way of doing that. And that same poll that I mentioned earlier, which had the SNP on 56% for a yes vote, sees them getting twice the party vote of the second place party, the Conservatives in Scotland. I mean, at this rate, they're going to walk the Scottish Parliament elections in 2021, and that comes with a worry for them around complacency and what that looks like. But she fronts it out. Every day she's on the airwaves talking about COVID-19, addressing people's questions directly. She looks like she's in control, and people trust her. That's not just my opinion, that's quite clearly evidenced in this poll, which is out there today. And, Alex Massey's written a cracking piece, on several occasions over the past few weeks, examining the SNP's record and some of those key issues which are devolved. And, I used to go head to head in the chamber with Nicola Sturgeon every week at First Minister's Questions. I did that for 2.5 years, and I did that regularly on education and in health. The evidence for the shortcomings are there. I always argued that she had almost sought to replace Labour when it came to social policy, that was trying to replace the Conservatives when it came to economic policy. She's been very shy at using the tax powers that the Parliament has. It's about delivering a social democracy, but from the voters' perspective, she's a very competent manager of Scottish public affairs, and they're rewarding her with that, with their votes in elections.
And I thought it was very interesting this week when she announced this £500 bonus for healthcare workers, and then immediately said, and yes, Boris Johnson, don't you charge them tax on it, immediately putting the onus on him to respond to what she knew would be quite a popular thing. She's a very skillful politician. We will have more questions from you in a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question. You're listening to LBC. It's 8:30, and Serena Farrow has a news headline.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:35, cross question with Mark Harper, Inaya Folarin Iman, and Kezia Dugdale and Paul Embery are with us taking your calls. Eddie is in Barrow-in-Furness. Hello, Eddie. What would you like to ask?
It's a two-part question. First part, do the panel believe that the tier system is actually going to work? And the second part of it is do the panel believe that the government handouts, the grants, are actually getting to the right people?
Paul Embery.
The tiers system is completely inconsistent in places. That's, I think, abundantly clear. We've had some silly stories about Scotch eggs as well. And, I touched on earlier, I think the broader point is whether or not the lockdowns were necessary to the degree that we saw in the first place, and what the impact of that is going to be in the long term in terms of the economy and jobs, etc. But the thing that worries me, we're now at a position where we're going back into the tiered restrictions. I think throughout this whole pandemic in the UK, there has been some very serious mission creep. If you remember, when we went into the original lockdown back in March, we were told that we were just buying time effectively to stop the NHS from being overwhelmed, and that we'd all be back to normal very soon. And during that time, we'd build capacity in the NHS to allow it to cope. Actually, NHS England has released data showing that something like 88% of NHS beds are currently available, compared to 88% being used compared to 95% at a similar time last year, and actually only 4 hospitals are busier than they were last year in England. So I think the debate is greater than the obvious inconsistencies in some of the restrictions around the tiers, and the fact that what started out as a pretty straightforward lockdown to allow us to stop the NHS from being overwhelmed has now moved into compulsory masks and further lockdowns and other restrictions on people's civil liberties that I think all of us should be fearful about. As I said at the outset, this is not ultimately a virus that poses a serious threat to the vast majority of people. And I think, many people throughout the population have been scared witless by the government and by some of the media messaging around it. And I think in the end, we're going to pay a huge price, which will put issues around tiers pale into insignificance, frankly.
Kezia, there are 5 tiers in Scotland, I believe. Has that system got public support? And is there a Mark Harper equivalent in Scotland that's trying to fight it?
A Mark Harper equivalent, a Scottish Mark Harper. I'm not trying to picture who that might be. I don't think it exists, but that doesn't mean there isn't resistance to the tier system. Of course there is. It's funny, I'm living in a tier 3 area just now, and I will be, I think, until the 11th of December, and perhaps further still until Christmas. But in reality, I haven't lived a normal life like many of us since March. I walked out of my office in Glasgow one Thursday afternoon and I haven't been back. So it's 9 months worth of restrictions. I struggle with a little bit with this argument that, to wear a mask is a civil liberty infringement. Perhaps it's just where I sit in a political spectrum, but I just see it as something I can do to protect a neighbour from me, or something that I might have that I don't know that I have. I see it as an act of kind of solidarity and kindness, and something that one citizen can do for the benefit of another. That said, of course, I'm fed up. Of course, I want the tiers to make a difference. I think there's evidence coming from Wales and elsewhere that they do make a slight difference, but not enough of a difference. But if the alternative is a full lockdown everywhere, then I'd rather avoid that at all costs too. The idea that we either choose the economy or the health of the people as some sort of binary choice is a false one. They're interrelated issues, and we need to try and make the very best of both.
Inaya.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with Paul on this. I think that actually many of the kind of premises of the lockdown need to be fundamentally challenged. I mean, we were originally told it was a short and sharp lockdown, and what's transpired is absolutely far from what was originally understood and what a lot of people agreed to. And I think many people for a long time have kind of said the cure can't be worse than the disease. And instead of heeding those calls, the government has doubled down, and they've got themselves into this bind now where many people are not actually really following the restrictions properly. We don't know when this is going to end. And I think there seems to be absolutely no vision for the future.
But what's the alternative? Because the evidence is that a 4-week lockdown does cut infection rates, whereas a 2-week one, which the Welsh government did, that didn't really bring down infection rates to the extent that they needed to. So are you saying there shouldn't be any kind of restrictions?
Well, I think that obviously the information was put out, back in March now. I think many people genuinely have enough information to be able to make a decision based over their own personal health or their families, and should be able to follow those. But also there are other options, for example, the Great Barrington Declaration, which was a very targeted response to the most vulnerable. So this idea that there was only one route is part of the narrative that's just fundamentally untrue. And we know it's not true because it's not actually been really effective. We've had to go into lockdown several times. We're even being told that there's a potential for another one in the new year. Now we have this tiered system. That and the kind of track and trace thing has not actually been effective as well. So what we're finding is that even this particular route isn't necessarily the one that's actually effective. But on top of that, the second kind of question in regards to putting money to kind of different businesses, this is just not enough. In some senses, it's a slap in the face. Many companies, businesses are on the verge of collapse. There needs to be a really kind of fundamental kind of big imagination in terms of how to respond to the very real and significant impending difficulty that so many people up and down the country are going to have to experience. And I don't think that we fully grapple with the reality of what we're going into.
Now, Mark Harper, you've been arguing against... Sorry, go on, Kezia.
I was just going to say, I think we're forgetting that 600 people died today. We've become a bit immune.
I don't think people are forgetting that.
Pardon?
I don't think people are forgetting that. I think we're trying to have a kind of rational conversation about the kind of merits and kind of demerits of various different approaches. And I think that actually this is part of the rhetoric to kind of suggest that people that critique the government's response in some way or critique the harder response are somehow less caring of the actual deaths that are going on. That's absolutely not the case.
Neither is it the point that I just made. I was just simply suggesting that I think there's substantial evidence that were it not for the tier system, that 600 figure would be a lot higher. So, what price is human life?
OK, Mark Harper, you've been arguing against the government's approach. You must have a lot of sympathy with what Inaya was saying there.
Well, look, my argument, if I answer Eddie's question directly, which is do I think the tier system that was introduced today is going to be effective? The honest answer is I don't know. Part of the reason why
how could you argue against it, then, if you don't know?
Part of the reason why I had a debate with the government this week and ended up voting against the government yesterday is my argument with the government was I agree, so picking up Kezia's point, that this is a deadly disease for a significant number of people, because actually the number of people who are over 60 or people with health conditions is actually quite a large number of people. So it is a serious issue. But I also agree that the economic costs here, I mean, we saw in the OBR last week how big they are. I don't think people have quite worked out that probably for the next decade, in the same way we were with the financial crash, we're going to be living with the consequences of this. And that's going to have consequences for jobs and for businesses as well. And the question is, how do we balance those two things? Because although it's very uncomfortable, we do put a price on life all the time. When we're making judgments about drugs and when they get approved and is the health service going to pay for them, we add up how many years of life people are going to get and what sort of quality it is. And we do put a price on it when we're doing those things. Very uncomfortable discussion, but we do. But it's about balance. And to make that balance, you need to understand what the trade-offs are. And so my argument this week and why I wasn't persuaded to vote for the government yesterday was because the economic analysis they did, I'm afraid, was it was just poor.
I could have written that in half.
Well, and you're professionally the journalist. I mean, looked at it and took 5 minutes and just realised it really wasn't.
It was laughable.
It was pretty, well, it was.
It was embarrassing.
And it wasn't a serious attempt to look at the economic consequences. But equally, if you ask and look at what bits of the tier system, what effect they have on bearing down on the virus, the government can't tell you that either. So I don't know, for example, the massive consequence on hospitality businesses, not just those in Tier 3 that are shut, but those in Tier 2 that aren't going to have customers because you can't mix indoors with people you don't live with. If I say, well, what is it, how much impact is that going to have on bearing down on the virus, since we don't have any very good evidence that it transmits in venues that are following the rules? No one can tell me. So you've got to be able to weigh these things up. And so the honest answer to Eddie is I don't know.
Right, Eddie, do you know?
Well, on the lockdown part, I think it's laughable, if I'm honest. The first lockdown, people were treated, obviously I'm referring to my own area, but people were treating it like a paid holiday. And now they've brought it in again they've now put the tier system back in again. And again, there's a lot of businesses out there that can't cope with no money coming in. And when you go for the relevant grant, which is the second part of my question I put to you, it's left to the local authority to decide if and when you get the money, which I think is absolutely astounding. Because there's companies out there, and I'm one of them, to make you aware of why I'm passionate about this, that didn't get any money on the first handout, and by the look of it, are not going to get any money on this handout. And yet, at
least, Eddie, we are free to listen to, so you don't have to pay a subscription for this. Thank you very much indeed. We'll take more of your questions on LBC. Chris in South Croydon has got a question for our panel. Hi, Chris.
Oh, good evening, Iain. Good evening, panel. My question is this. If the price of a Brexit deal is the status quo in fisheries, should we just walk away?
Inaya.
I think that's a very good question. I think that when it comes to the kind of Brexit deal, I think the politicians need to fundamentally remember the reason why so many people voted for Brexit, and particularly the fisheries and many of those key industries have felt that they've been significantly left worse off by the kind of situation that we had with the European Union. And so I think that some of those things do need to be a red line, because I think that a lot of people will feel cheated, that one of the reasons why, which was this idea of taking back control, was not fully actualised. And so I think that actually it should be a red line. I think that the politicians in the UK need to be very strong on this. This was one of the biggest democratic votes in British history, and so they have a significant mandate to follow through. And the Conservatives in particular, the whole narrative of get Brexit done, if they don't fully do that, then I think that will be very, very significant.
But fishing contributes 0.01% of our gross domestic product, about 450 million contribution to our economy. It's not a big sector. Symbolically, it's important, but should they really jeopardise a whole trade deal with all the damage that a no deal would do to the economy just for the sake of an industry that contributes so little to the economy?
Well, I think that the idea of it being symbolic was a significant element to the question. Like, I do think that it's much more than just the kind of economic reality. And I think that Brexit was much more than economics. It was about, as I said, taking back control. It was the kind of symbolic feeling of having control over these major decisions of the country. So I do think that it would matter. But also, I do think that this kind of binary between this trade deal or a no deal is a kind of somewhat false dichotomy. There's often sector by sector trade deals that can be done. So I do think there are manoeuvring happening that could happen. I think a no deal is something that obviously would be detrimental for both sides, but I also don't think that it would be the worst thing in the world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Paul Embery.
Well, I think on your point, Ian, I think part of the reason fishing is no longer such a big sector is actually in large part because of our membership of the EU and some of the impacts on the fishing industry, particularly in terms of quotas, etc. But we need to be prepared to walk away. In any negotiation, I say this as a trade unionist, the other side needs to know that you're not in it to get a deal at any cost. You are prepared to get up from the table and walk away. I don't think the EU ever got that impression when Theresa May was in charge, not just because of her, but I think because of the messages that Parliament was sending at the time, that they weren't prepared to accept no deal. I hope the mood music in the negotiations is a bit different now. I suspect there'll be a deal at the 11th hour. There usually is, I think, with these things. It goes down to the wire. There's a lot of posturing. There's a lot of brinkmanship. That's how negotiations work. But this issue for me has never just been about the particulars of the deal. I mean, I'm on the left. I'm that rare thing these days. I'm a pro-Brexiteer on the left. There used to be lots of us. There's not very many of us around now. And I think that we're better off out deal or no deal. I've always regarded the European Union as an explicitly anti-socialist institution which promotes austerity and neoliberalism, lack of democracy, etc. Very much what the likes of Tony Benn and Peter Shaw used to argue. But the Labour movement is a different beast now. But I think that we do, whether or not we get what we want on fishing, I don't know. But on the broader point, we do need to be prepared to walk away because I think a better future does await us outside of the EU.
Kezia Dugdale, the Scottish fishing industry is actually rather more significant, I think, than possibly south of the border. How do you answer Chris's question?
That was going to be my first point, Ian, is that it might not be a big sector across the whole of the UK, but it is a big deal in Scotland, particularly in certain geographic areas. I mean, one of the main reasons it's a shrinking industry, though, is because as a nation, we don't eat that much fish. And the fish that we do eat, we tend to import. And the reason I mentioned that, actually, is because we talk about the fishing sector, the fishing industry as one homogenous entity, when actually it's quite varied. So, as Labour leader, I used to go to the northeast of Scotland where you'd find a lot of support for Brexit because people wanted more control over the waters there for what they fished in that part of the country. But equally, I've been out talking to fishermen in the Western Isles who fish largely for langoustines and scallops, which they sell into Europe, products with a shelf life of 48 hours. Those fishermen are very pro-Europe because they need to be able to get that product to restaurants very, very quickly without any trade barriers. So, let's drop this idea that, the fishing sector is one homogenous industry with one very clear voice on the issue of Brexit and recognise that how we trade is just important as what we can fish. And I don't think fish will hold back this deal. I think we're still in a period of substantial brinkmanship. I hope that a deal will come. It will never be the deal that I want, because I'm still desperately sad and sorry that we're leaving the European Union. And I appreciate that's an unpopular view, but that's where we are.
So I agree with what Paul said. You've got to be prepared to walk away because you don't get a good deal otherwise. One of the reasons why this is challenging, and going back to Chris's question about the status quo, is the EU seems to be having trouble with the concept that we have left the European Union and we're an independent coastal state. So the starting position, from our point of view, is the waters are ours, the fish are ours, and of course we're prepared to do a deal with the EU to allow some of their fishermen to catch fish because we want to sell into their market. They're starting from the status quo where they think we're still in the EU even though we left in at the beginning of this year, and that is a bit of a blockage, I think. But I think the two sides really ought to be able to keep talking on that issue and get to a deal.
The fact that
because it is in both sides' interest to get a deal.
And we haven't really heard much briefing from either side over the last few days, which I would take as a positive sign. Am I being naive?
No, my understanding of how these things work is that when you stop hearing from people is when they're basically trying to finish it off, what's called being in the tunnel. And I think we should be able to come to a deal that we can all live with. Of course, it'll have compromises. That's how you get deals. But it won't be the status quo, and I think we can get one, and I think that's the challenge for Lord Frost and Michel Barnier.
Chris, I'm not going to come back to you because we're running out of time, and I just want to squeeze in Ben in High Wycombe. Ben, can you ask a question quite quickly, please?
Yeah, evening panel. Right, so my question is, what are the opinions of the panel on which government is likely to do more, or would do more, or will do more to improve the lives of the white working class, a Keir Starmer-led Labour government or Boris Johnson's Conservatives, and why?
Opportunity for a book plug from Paul Embery. 45 seconds for each of the rest of you. 1 minute to Paul.
Very kind. Well, I'm a member of the Labour Party, so I daren't say anything other than the Labour Party because I should imagine I'll be kicked out pretty quickly. But yes, I mean, I think the Labour Party is the vehicle still that is best placed to improve the lives of ordinary working people in this country. I think historically it's played that role. I would like to see it play that role again if it's going to do it. It needs to start speaking the language of working class communities. I don't actually like the term white working class. Actually, the working class is more than one colour, and we should remember that. But the Labour Party needs to start speaking about the issues that matter to people, the things that usually cause Labour activists to stare down at the ground and shuffle their feet in embarrassment. Until it can learn, what matters to people, what the stresses are that affect people's everyday lives, what their priorities are in those sort of red wall post-industrial communities, then it's the chasm that exists now between them is going to stay.
Kezia, you're looking down. I can't see if you're shuffling your feet, though.
No, I was thinking long and hard about the question and how to answer it diplomatically in 45 seconds. I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I still believe that it's the most natural party to tackle poverty and inequality and to promote social mobility. But I'm listening very hard to what Paul has to say in terms of what needs to change, and I'm going to read his book. How about that?
Well, can't ask more than that. Mark Harper, given the Red Wall situation and that Boris Johnson seems to be going out of his way to alienate Red Wall voters at the moment, how do you answer Ben's question?
Well, I go back to agreeing with what the voters themselves said in December. If you look in December, it's very clear a majority of working class voters think that Boris Johnson's going to do well by them, which is why a majority of working class voters voted for him and our party. And I think that's the focus. And it's not just in the Red Wall seats. My constituency was represented by a Labour MP for a long period of time. It's got lots of working class voters, backgrounds similar to the one I come from. It's about opportunity. It's about making sure that we give every single voter the maximum opportunities to be successful and do what they want to do. And I think if we do that, then we'll continue getting their votes.
I'm glad to know your constituency has working class voters, because the only time I've ever been to visit you in it, we were in a castle. But there we are.
Yes. But that's not most people's experience.
Inaya.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably have to agree with Mark. I think that as much as I personally think both of the parties are a disappointment, the kind of election proved that many working class people, particularly in those Red Wall seats, are politically experimenting and are disappointed in Labour and don't think that they have kind of fulfilled what they were originally kind of set out as a working class party to do. And so many of them are now joining and supporting the Conservative Party, if not only temporary. So we'll have to find out.
Right, quick final text question from Terry in Chatsworth. Spotify have told me today that I've listened to more Cliff Richard today than anyone else. What have the panel been listening to most this year? I emphasise that was Terry who's been listening to Cliff Richard, not me. Now, it doesn't have to be music. It could be something else if you don't do Spotify. Mark Harper.
I'm going to give a shameless plug, Ian, to your fantastic podcast, For the Many, that you do with Jeffrey Smith, which I listen to while I'm taking my Labradors for a walk. That's my shameless
which guarantees you a permanent weekly place on this panel. Well done. Inaya.
Oh, I've been listening to Blogging Heads podcast, Glenn Lowry on YouTube, so that's been something taking up my time because of Black Lives Matter and all that debate, so that's been very interesting.
Okay, Paul?
I've listened again to the CDs of the Tony Benn diaries. I've been a huge fan of his. They're a fantastic record of the events that took place in British politics in the 70s and 80s particularly, and a bit of Frank Sinatra too.
Oh, dear.
Love it.
Never seen the appeal of Frank Sinatra. Kezia?
Well, the last book I listened to online was yours, Ian, and I think that's a nice way to end it. So why can't we
I think it's a... Which particular book would that be, Kezia?
Why can't we all just get along? Not the Prime Minister's one.
Not the Prime Minister's. Oh, you can do that over Christmas. It's 20 hours long on the audio.
You've got both of them in now.
Right, thank you to all four of you. Kezia Dugdale, Paul Embery, Inaya Folarin Iman and Mark Harper. We'll be back next week with a cross question at 8 o'clock as